He was the man whose presence defined a decade sharp, enigmatic, effortlessly modern. In Blow Up, David Hemmings didn't just play a role. He captured the restless pulse of a generation that believed it was reinventing the world. His expression, his movements, even the stillness in his gaze became symbols of an era that seemed boundless. For a moment, he was everywhere. He was unavoidable. He was the future. And then, almost imperceptibly, he slipped out of the frame. The star who once embodied the spirit of swinging London drifted into obscurity without explanation. No scandal, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet fading that left more questions than answers. Behind his iconic image lay a story of tension, conflict, and unspoken truths that never reached the public eye. Even those who worked closest to him sensed there were chapters he deliberately kept in the dark. People remembered the photographs, the coolness, the legend of his youth. But almost no one knew what unfolded when the spotlight turned away and what shadows remained behind him. Why did a man at the center of everything suddenly disappear? And what truths were buried beneath the image the world thought it understood? Before the world attached his name to a cultural awakening, David Hemmings had already lived several lifetimes. He had been a prodigy on the opera stage, a young performer shaped by discipline rather than choice, and later a restless artist searching for a path that felt like his own. But everything changed the moment he stepped into the frame of Blow Up. The film didn't simply showcase his talent, it crystallized an era. He became the embodiment of London's creative explosion, the face that reflected the bold, unpredictable energy of the 1,960 seconds. Newspapers traced his every move. Conversations in cafes, studios, and galleries echoed his name. To many, he represented the spirit of a generation that refused to follow old rules. Directors saw in him a raw electricity that couldn't be staged. Audiences felt an authenticity that made him unforgettable. His rise seemed unstoppable, the kind of ascent reserved for those destined to reshape the landscape of cinema. Yet beneath the surface of this meteoric climb lay the tension between what the world celebrated and what he lived privately. Behind the headlines and praise was a man navigating demands he never asked for, expectations that grew heavier each year, and a system whose embrace could turn cold without warning. His greatest triumph marked the beginning of a story far more complicated than anyone realized. Long before he became the emblem of a cultural revolution, David Hemmings carried the weight of expectations that had been placed on him far too early. As a child, his life was orchestrated around performance. His remarkable voice earned him roles on prominent opera stages, placing him under bright lights long before he understood what fame demanded. To audiences, he was a wonder precise, composed, almost ethereal. But behind the applause was a boy trying to grow into a world that didn't quite fit him. When his voice changed during adolescence, the path that once defined him vanished overnight. It was a moment of rupture, leaving him standing at a crossroads he had never prepared for. Acting emerged not through ambition but through necessity, a space where he could express himself without the rigid perfection opera required. Even in the smallest roles, directors recognized something distinct. There was an unpredictability in him, a spark that suggested he was meant for more than reciting lines. London's cultural renaissance of the early 1,960 seconds became the backdrop to his transformation. The city thrummed with possibility. Music, art, film, fashion fused into a single pulse. Hemmings blended into that rhythm with ease. He was unconventional, instinctive, and uninterested in fitting into tidy categories. Still, true recognition eluded him. He worked tirelessly, moving from project to project, waiting for the moment when everything would align. That moment arrived unexpectedly. Michelangelo Antonioni, seeking someone who defied cinematic norms, crossed paths with the young actor. There was something in Hemmings, a detached intensity, a silent rebellion that resonated with the director's vision. He didn't radiate classic movie star polish. Instead, he carried a rawness that reflected the changing world around him. He didn't rise because he chased the spotlight. He rose because the spotlight, for a brief and electrifying moment, recognized him as a reflection of its time. The triumph of Blow Up ignited a blaze of attention around David Hemmings, but what glittered in public often weighed heavily in private. Fame arrived swiftly, wrapping him in admiration he had never sought, and pushing him into circles where influence operated behind closed doors. In those rooms, charm and talent weren't enough. There were expectations, quiet agreements, unspoken obligations, and pathways paved not by artistry, but by compliance. Hemmings had no interest in surrendering himself to that system, and the price of refusal was far greater than he realized. His independence, once seen as a refreshing departure from tradition, began to work against him. Roles that seemed secured suddenly slipped away. Meetings shifted into distant promises. Those around him noticed a subtle but undeniable shift. He was no longer being guided upward, but gently, deliberately pushed to the margins. People whispered that he had turned down the wrong proposals, refused the wrong invitations, questioned the wrong people. In Hollywood and London alike, reputations could be reshaped overnight, and for Hemmings, that reshaping came quietly, without explanation. His personal life became tangled in the turbulence. Moving between continents, navigating shifting relationships, and carrying the weight of uncertainty left him increasingly fractured. Friends described him as magnetic yet guarded, a man who carried emotion behind layers of dry humor and deflection. He worked relentlessly, perhaps in hopes that dedication alone could counter the silent barriers forming around him. Then came the rift with Antonioni. Their partnership had been poised for greatness, yet after the success of their landmark film, something between them broke. What began as creative disagreement deepened into a silence neither ever clarified. For outsiders, it was baffling. For Hemmings, it was a turning point, one that marked the beginning of doors quietly closing. Fame had granted him visibility and influence, but it demanded sacrifices he refused to make. And in an industry where compliance often determined longevity, his resistance carried consequences that would shape the rest of his career. The decline of David Hemmings did not erupt suddenly. It unfolded like a fading echo, subtle at first, then unmistakable. After the whirlwind of his early fame, he drifted into a period where momentum no longer pushed him forward. Roles became less substantial, opportunities less certain. The industry that had once embraced his unconventional magnetism now seemed unsure of where he belonged. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet shift that slowly erased him from the center of the stage. People around him noticed the early signs. Scripts that once arrived with enthusiasm now came with hesitation. Directors who previously praised his originality began redirecting their interest elsewhere. It wasn't rejection in the traditional sense. It was a slow withdrawal, as though someone had gradually turned down the volume of his presence in the industry. For an artist who never relied on superficiality, this silence carried a weight he rarely spoke about. His restlessness deepened. He poured himself into work, yet the work no longer brought the same fulfillment. He tried to reinvent himself, taking on a mixture of projects that ranged from ambitious to uninspired. The effort was constant, but the results felt increasingly hollow. Privately, he grappled with emotions he masked beneath confidence and humor. Notes from this period revealed a man caught between resilience and resignation, a man who sensed that something beyond his control was shaping his trajectory. His personal life mirrored this unraveling. The instability of his career created emotional fractures he struggled to mend. He kept moving, kept working, kept trying to reclaim the spark that once set him apart. But the industry's silence grew louder, and the distance between him and the world that once celebrated him widened. What remains most haunting is the ambiguity of it all. There was no defining scandal, no catastrophic incident, just a slow dimming of a light that had once burned fiercely. His disappearance from the spotlight wasn't a collapse, it was an erasure, one that left behind questions no one ever truly answered. When David Hemmings transitioned into directing, many believed he had finally discovered a refuge, a corner of the industry where he could work without the scrutiny that once shadowed him. Behind the camera, he approached storytelling with a meticulous calm, as though directing allowed him to reclaim a sense of control that acting had long denied him. His sets were said to be grounded and collaborative. He didn't command attention, he invited it. It was a quieter existence, but one that reflected a man rebuilding himself from the inside out. Years later, When he returned to acting, the shift in him was unmistakable. Gone was the rebellious intensity that defined his youth. In its place was a depth shaped by experience, by loss, by long stretches of silence. His performances carried the weight of someone who had lived through fame's sharpest edges. Directors admired this maturity, and audiences who remembered him felt a bittersweet nostalgia whenever he appeared on screen. He no longer played the icon, he played the survivor. Those final years were steady, though not glamorous. He worked far from the spotlight that once consumed him, focusing on character roles in projects that valued craft over attention. Colleagues described him as generous, thoughtful, and unexpectedly humble, someone who seemed at peace with the contradictions of his past. Yet there were moments, rare but telling, when he appeared distant glimpses of a man still navigating the echoes of old battles. His final days in Romania added a layer of mystery that still lingers. He had been working diligently, sharing meals with the crew, discussing scenes with quiet enthusiasm. Nothing suggested frailty, nothing hinted at an approaching farewell. Then, without warning, he slipped away on an otherwise ordinary evening. The accounts were brief, the explanations vague, leaving those who admired him with an unsettling blend of shock and uncertainty. His last curtain call arrived not under bright lights, but in stillness far from the cities that once defined him. And in that quiet end, his life took on a haunting symmetry. A man who changed cinema, yet departed in near silence, just as he had once been pushed into it. Legacies are rarely straightforward. Some shine brightly in public memory, while others linger in quieter spaces recognized by a devoted few, rediscovered by those willing to look beyond the surface. David Hemmings occupies a place somewhere between those two worlds. His image in Blow Up remains iconic, a snapshot of a decade defined by reinvention. He became the visual language of swinging London, the embodiment of a cultural shift that changed the way cinema understood youth, rebellion, and identity. Yet his legacy extends far beyond that single moment. The years he spent behind the camera revealed an artist deeply committed to storytelling, someone who nurtured talent and crafted work with an attention to detail that often went unnoticed by the mainstream. Those who collaborated with him remember a man of quiet intensity, disciplined, dedicated, and far more generous than his enigmatic public persona suggested. For audiences who rediscovered him later in life, his performances carried a resonance shaped by everything he had endured. He appeared not as a figure chasing a lost past, but as someone who had lived enough to understand the fragility of acclaim. In that sense, his later roles offered something deeper than nostalgia. They offered truth. What remains of David Hemmings is not merely the memory of a young man immortalized in one of cinema's defining films. It is the imprint of an artist who moved through fame, silence, and reinvention, with a resilience that defied the forces working against him. His story endures in the lingering question of what he might have achieved had he been given the space to follow his own path without interference. David Hemmings's journey reminds us that fame is never a straight line. It dazzles, it elevates, and then, sometimes without warning, it retreats, leaving behind the quiet truths that only time can reveal. He was a symbol of a revolution in art and culture, a face that reshaped cinema's understanding of coolness, authenticity, and rebellion. Yet behind that legend was a man navigating pressures, silences, and choices that the world never fully saw. His life unfolded between brilliance and obscurity, between recognition and erasure, between the expectations of others and the person he was trying to become. Looking back, his story feels both triumphant and bittersweet. He gave the world a defining moment in film history, but was denied the continuity that such a moment should have guaranteed. His legacy is not just in the role that made him famous, but in the resilience he carried long after the applause faded. He remained a creator, a storyteller, a survivor of an industry that can be as unforgiving as it is glamorous. What will you remember most about David Hemmings? And if his story had taken a different turn, what do you believe he could have become? If this journey spoke to you, feel free to share your thoughts, revisit his work, or honor his legacy by keeping his name alive in the conversation.